I was a kid, I grew up in rural Dakota. There wasn't much around. If you like being surrounded by trees, farmland, and plenty of silence, it was the perfect place. For me, though, it was a mix of solitude and monotony. My name is Ethan, and I left that place as soon as I had a car and enough money to move. It wasn't that I hated nature, but I always preferred the energy of a big city. My father, Russell, and my mother, Diane, were the owners of that property. They sold it about 5 years ago, but it's still vivid in my memory. It was a 3-acre property. The house was big, with 2 stories and many windows that looked out onto the vast yard. Behind it, there was a metal storage building, a place where we stored everything from tools to the lawnmower. I was 13 when what I'm about to tell you happened. Back then, my parents would leave me alone often. They trusted me because I was always more responsible than most kids my age. Plus, there were always tasks to do on the property, and I always managed them. I remember it was a weekend. The sky was cloudy, and the sunlight seemed to struggle to break through the tree canopies. I was sitting in the living room playing Vice City on my old PlayStation 2, lost in the game's noise and the atmosphere of the day. That's when I heard a metallic thud from outside. The sound cut through the air so abruptly that the controller nearly slipped from my hands. My heart raced and I paused the game immediately. I jumped off the couch and ran to the front windows to try to see something, but everything looked normal. The trees swayed gently with the wind and the yard was empty. I decided to check the window that faced the storage building in the back. That's when I noticed that the door, which was always shut and locked, was wide open, swinging slightly. I felt a chill run up my spine. It wasn't just the fact that the door was open. It was the oppressive silence that seemed to envelop everything. No birds, no sound of the wind, just the muffled beat of my heart, thudding too loudly for comfort. My first reaction was to close the curtains and try to ignore what I had seen. Maybe the wind had blown the door open, I thought, trying to convince myself. But deep down something was telling me I needed to investigate. I don't know if it was curiosity or some strange sense of responsibility, but I grabbed my flashlight and went out. My dog Rex, a medium-sized German Shepherd, was lying on the porch. But strangely, he didn't seem interested in coming with me. That, in itself, was odd. Rex was usually the type to rush ahead into any situation, barking as if he were the ruler of the world. But that day, he just raised his head, looked at me for a few seconds, and lay back down, almost as if to say, "You're on your own, Ethan." As I walked across the yard, the wind seemed to grow colder. Each step echoed, and I felt more alone, even though I was just a few feet from the house. When I reached the storage building, I stood there for a few moments. The door was partially open, creaking slightly with each gust of wind. It didn't look like a normal movement caused by nature. There was something deliberate about the way the door swayed, as if someone or something had just passed through it. "Come on, Ethan. Just check and get back inside," I murmured to myself. I pushed the door open carefully, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The smell of rusted metal and dust filled the air the moment I stepped inside. The light of the flashlight swept over the space, revealing tools hanging on the walls, stacked boxes, and the silhouette of the lawnmower in the corner. Everything appeared to be in place. Then, I heard something, a low dragging sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, coming from the back of the building. My heart began to race so fast it felt like it was echoing through the confined space. "Is someone there?" My voice came out louder than I intended, breaking the silence like thunder. For a few seconds, nothing happened, just the sound of the wind outside and the distant rustling of the trees. But then, something fell with a loud crash. A box at the back of the building collapsed, scattering tools and metal pieces across the floor. I took a step back, almost stumbling. That's when I saw it. In the darkest corner of the building, something moved. It wasn't clear enough to make out what it was, but it was there. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen. It wasn't until Rex began barking frantically from outside that I was able to move. I bolted out of the building, not daring to look back, slamming the door shut behind me as I sprinted back to the house. Once inside, I collapsed on the couch, gasping for air. My chest burned, and my mind couldn't stop replaying what had just happened. I placed the flashlight on the kitchen table and sat there, trying to calm my frantic thoughts. But the silence wouldn't let me relax. The house was too quiet, and suddenly every sound felt amplified. Then I heard it, the first noise. A faint creak, like something being dragged across the floor upstairs. My heart leaped in my chest. Slowly, I got up and climbed the stairs, trying not to make a sound. I didn't know if I should go forward, but my curiosity kept me moving. The sounds became clearer as I ascended, slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone were walking down the corridor. The light from my flashlight wavered as I reached the top, casting shadows along the walls. All the doors to the bedrooms were closed, but I knew something wasn't right. The crack under my parents' bedroom door became more visible now, the faint light of my flashlight illuminating a strip of the floor. I approached slowly, my breath almost silent. The window ahead revealed only an empty corridor, but I knew there was something on the other side. Slowly, I dropped to my knees and peered through the crack. 2 bare feet faced away from the door. The sight made my stomach churn. What do you want?" I whispered, my voice cracking. I didn't know if I should scream or just run. But the silence of the house held me captive. The presence in that room was oppressive, almost physical. My hands trembled as I forced myself to stand and back away. Downstairs, my phone was still on, but my father didn't answer. The emergency operator told me to hide and stay quiet. But when I heard footsteps heading toward the bathroom door, something inside me broke. The distant, deep voice that followed still haunts me. "What's going on, kid?" It felt as if all the air in my lungs vanished. The voice seemed to come from the darkness itself, as if it already knew I was there. Without thinking, I responded in a trembling but firm voice, "I'm talking to the police. I have a gun." I placed the phone on speaker as the operator instructed me not to speak. The man at the door tried to open it, but the lock held firm. Then his footsteps faded, growing quieter until they eventually disappeared. After everything, sitting in the bathroom, I listened to the sounds from outside. I knew I would never be the same. My body still trembled as I crawled out, unable to believe what had just happened. The house felt unreachable, as if all the fear I felt had fused into the walls. I couldn't believe that man was still there, or that he might be lurking nearby, waiting. Hours passed in silence, each second leaving me more tense. The noise I heard seemed to have faded, but the threat lingered in my mind like a shadow. My breathing became the only sound echoing through the empty house. That's when I heard the distant sound of sirens growing louder. The shrill noise gave me a brief sense of relief, but also heightened my awareness. When the police arrived, I contacted them and told them everything I had experienced that night. The officers searched the house from top to bottom. My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest with each movement they made. The atmosphere in the house was thick with tension and fear, as if the air were about to burst. But after a thorough inspection, they confirmed the man had left. The officers asked if I had another place to stay. But at that moment, all I wanted was to get away and forget the images haunting me. I nodded yes and called my uncle. He came quickly, giving me a chance to escape the prison of terrifying memories. What haunts me the most is that it was my fault. I should have locked the storage building door. It would have been a simple action, but that carelessness nearly cost me my life. The memory of that night continues to haunt me. Even with the rifle in hand, I felt powerless, vulnerable, and terrified. To this day, when I hear a noise in the darkness, I fear that nightmare may return. Years later, I still carry those memories like a constant shadow. Sometimes I find myself replaying every detail, every sound, as if I could still change something. No matter how many years pass, the fear remains, buried somewhere deep in my mind. After that day, I never went back to the house. Even though it wasn't mine anymore, the weight of that experience stayed with me. I still feel the piercing gaze of that stranger, as if he left his mark on every wall, every corner. The silence of that night was more disturbing than any scream. Even with the police confirming he never came back, I couldn't fully convince myself. Sometimes I close my eyes and swear I hear his footsteps once more. I was 18 years old when my parents went on a week-long anniversary trip. My sister had already moved out, so I was left alone in the house. My parents' property was perched on top of a winding back road, surrounded by dense woods and vast distances between houses. The feeling of isolation was total. Everyone in town knew each other. We'd see familiar faces at the bars, the gas station, and the grocery store. I was used to the quiet, but I also knew how dangerous isolation could be, especially being alone in such a remote area. One day, while filling up my tank at the city's only gas station, a black Jeep Cherokee pulled up beside me. A man with a scruffy beard stepped out, calmly filling his own tank. This wasn't unusual. People in small towns often helped each other in casual ways. He seemed calm, focused on the gas. After a moment, he walked over to my side and asked with a friendly tone if I knew how to get to the main highway. I gave him the directions, feeling a bit uneasy but figuring he must be new to town. It was strange to see someone still using a notebook to jot down directions instead of a phone. After writing down my instructions, he returned to his Jeep, asked my name, and smiled when I told him it was Emily. "That's a lovely name," he said, before driving off in the opposite direction of where I had directed him. I didn't think much of it, returning home and continuing with my day as usual. That evening, however, I noticed strange noises in the shadows near the house. Surely it was just an animal, I thought, so I ignored it. But when I walked from the garage to the front door, I heard a voice calling my name from the darkness. "Emily," it whispered. My skin crawled and I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. I told my parents about it, but they brushed it off, thinking it was just a neighbor or someone mistaken. But I knew better. No one I knew would call me like that in the middle of the night with no introduction. The next day, I left the house again. As I approached the same gas station, I heard the same voice calling from the distance. This time, I didn't wait around. I ran back to the house, locked the door, and called the police. They came, checked the perimeter, and found nothing. But I felt no safer. The memory of that voice haunted me. When my parents returned, I felt a bit better. But what still haunted me was the certainty that the man from the gas station had followed me home. He knew my name, my address, and seemed to be waiting for the right moment to show up. That encounter left me constantly on edge, even years later, the fear never fully fading. That same night, after a long day at college, I was finally relaxing on the couch, half watching a movie. My apartment was located on the second floor of an old building in a quiet part of town. Living alone, I appreciated the stillness of the night. Suddenly, the landline phone rang, unusual, since I rarely received calls on that number. My pulse quickened as I picked it up. "Hello?" I called, but only silence greeted me. The sound of heavy breathing followed. The person was there but didn't speak. Terrified, I hung up, but within moments the phone rang again. This time my hand trembled as I answered. A low, almost whispering voice said my name. "Lucas," it breathed. My heart leapt. Who could know my name? The voice was unfamiliar, and the silence after the call made it even more unsettling. I tried calling back, but the number went straight to voicemail. It was unknown. I tried to shake off the rising fear and went outside for some fresh air, walking the quiet streets hoping to clear my head. Yet the feeling of being watched never left me. My phone rang again. I answered, my anxiety worsening, as the same distorted voice said, "Lucas, don't run." Those 3 chilling words echoed in my mind. I was paralyzed, unable to move before I hung up. I couldn't sleep that night. I checked all my doors and windows, ensuring everything was locked, but it felt pointless. I kept searching for information about the number but found nothing but dead ends and error messages. The next day I went to the police. I told them everything, but they seemed skeptical. No one took the anonymous calls seriously, dismissing them as pranks. But I knew better. There was something far more sinister at play. Since that day, the silence of the nights has never been the same. Even after the calls stopped, the memory of that voice has never left me. Whoever was calling knew too much. They were watching, waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. still remember that night as if it had happened yesterday. It was an ordinary day, months before the start of the lockdown. My family had gone out to visit some friends, leaving me home alone. I was around 15 or 16 years old, and back then, like any typical teenager, I spent a lot of my time holed up in my room, playing StarCraft on the computer. I was completely obsessed with the game and would often lose track of time, savoring every second to level up or win a new battle. The night started off peaceful until the doorbell rang, twice. In the quiet of the empty house, the sound of the doorbell felt unnaturally loud. I rushed to the door hoping it was just a mistake, but also anxious not to miss some crucial moment in my game. I asked who was at the door, but the response wasn't clear. A soft, elderly voice, almost whispering, requested to be let in to use a phone. The woman standing on the doorstep had a gentle smile, but there was something off about her gaze. I had always been taught not to let strangers into the house, regardless of who they claimed to be. At that moment, though I felt an inexplicable discomfort, I couldn't quite explain what was making me uneasy. Politely, I told her that the nearby library had a phone and that she should go there. I knew the library would likely be closed, but it was the only solution I could think of. The woman continued to smile, but her expression grew more unsettling, as though she wouldn't accept my answer. "It's rude to refuse help to someone in need," she said softly. Trying to stay calm, I repeated that it was a rule not to let strangers inside. I started closing the door, offering an apologetic smile, but as I glanced back, I noticed her expression had shifted. The smile remained, but now it looked far more sinister. I bolted back to my room, my mind racing with unanswered questions. I sat back at the computer, trying to shake off the unease. But then, just minutes later, I heard a metallic tapping at the window. The curtain was closed, but the sound persisted from outside. My heart pounded as I imagined who, or what, was standing there. Was it the woman? Had she walked to my window? I turned off the computer, trying to ignore the noise, but it continued relentlessly. My chest felt tight, so I left my room and hid in the darkened living room. The silence there felt less threatening, but soon the doorbell rang again. I knew I wouldn't open the door if it was the same woman. Something felt terribly wrong. My legs froze, and a whisper in my mind told me to just wait for whatever it was to pass. Eventually, I closed the door and curled up in bed, the TV on to distract me, but each passing minute only made the metallic tapping at the window and the incessant doorbell feel more haunting. The thought that someone was determined to get inside consumed me. I prayed for the night to end, hoping the fear would fade with the morning. By morning, the sun was barely rising. I usually went for a morning walk in the park, a habit that helped me start the day fresh. But that morning felt different. There was an oppressive silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I went to the kitchen to make coffee, lost in thoughts of the day ahead. That's when I heard a strange sound from the living room, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, unsure of what it could be. Cautiously, I approached the area, my heart racing. The room was silent, and nothing appeared out of place. I returned to the kitchen, forcing myself to ignore the discomfort. Shortly after, while washing the dishes, I heard another knock at the front door. My hands trembled as I rushed to the door, but when I looked through the window, there was no one there. It was strange. For a moment, I considered ignoring it and moving on with my day, but something deep inside wouldn't let me. It felt wrong to dismiss it. I sat down at the table and resolved to check the entire house. I inspected all the windows and doors, ensuring they were locked. Everything seemed normal, but the nagging feeling that something was out of place refused to leave. I sat back down in the living room, trying to focus on the work I needed to do, but every sound made me jump. Then, I heard a faint whisper, so soft that I almost doubted whether I had really heard it. I stood up, following the sound down the hallway. My body was tense, but curiosity and fear pushed me forward. When I reached the end of the hallway, I found the door to the back bedroom slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine. I knew I should turn around, but I couldn't move. My heart pounded as I gently pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the air felt cold and thick. I looked down and saw footprints, strange as they didn't belong to me. They had come from outside, but instead of leading back outside, they stopped there inside the room. I closed the door quietly, unsure of what to do. The silence now felt heavier than ever. I locked the door to the bedroom and backed away. I couldn't think clearly, only wanting to escape. I grabbed my car keys and fled without looking back. As I drove, the only thought in my head was how impossible it all felt. Yet, the fear stayed with me, persistent, as though someone or something was still there, somewhere. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The strange feeling and whispers in the hallway haunted me. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me told me I needed to go back home. Fear and curiosity churned inside me as I made the decision to return. When I arrived, the house felt different. The silence was thicker, and this time, I sensed that something wasn't just out of place. It felt entirely out of control. I moved cautiously, gripping my keys tightly. My heart pounded. I entered the living room, and at first glance, everything seemed calm. But as I looked around, I noticed details I had missed before. The curtains were slightly swaying, as if someone had entered or left. In the corner of the couch, there were fingerprints, marks that clearly weren't mine. With my stomach in knots, I moved toward the hallway, more hesitant this time. Each step echoed inside me. I focused on staying calm, but the air felt thick, and everything felt tense. I reached the back bedroom where the footprints had appeared before. The door was still slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and moved closer. The footprints on the floor were still there, unchanged. But what shocked me more was something I hadn't noticed before. A door at the back of the room cracked open. My heart raced, and for a moment I wanted to run. But something urged me to keep going. I turned the handle and stepped through. On the other side was a narrow hallway that led to another room. A dim light from a bedside lamp cast shadows over the space. I could feel the heavy air as though every breath echoed in the darkness. As I looked around, I saw the room was filled with strange objects. Old photographs, some crumpled, others with burnt edges. But what really caught my attention were the drawings on the walls, unintelligible figures scrawled in faded paint. With each step, my fear grew, but a part of me still wanted answers. I approached a table in the center of the room and found an open notebook. The pages were filled with nearly illegible, desperate notes. They're here. I can't escape. They come when I least expect. I have to warn them. I have to run. My whole body shuddered. I couldn't stop reading, even though I knew I should. I quickly shut the notebook as if that would shield me. I looked around, and on the wall, I noticed something else. A cracked mirror. The reflection I saw wasn't mine. It was like someone was standing behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. My body felt tense, my nerves frayed. I didn't know if I should run or face what was waiting. One thing was clear. I couldn't sleep peacefully knowing something was beyond my understanding. As days passed, the strangeness in the house only grew. Whenever I looked over my shoulder, I felt as though something was watching, following me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something existed beyond what I could see. At breakfast, even taking a sip of water left me unsettled. It was as if something was always watching, waiting for the right moment to act. I felt trapped in a nightmare with no end. One day, I decided to do what I should have from the beginning, seek answers. I went back to the back room, the one that had given me chills from the very first moment. The notebook with the notes was still sitting on the table. This time I read through it more carefully. Each page seemed to scream a hidden truth, even though the words were jumbled and desperate. The phrases unsettled me, gripping me as if they were whispers of a secret I wasn't supposed to know. They're here. They won't leave me alone. You have to get out. You can't run. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. With every word I read, I felt more connected to something that transcended the ordinary. It was as if each line told a story of fear and despair, something ancient and dark that should never have been awakened. I closed the notebook again and looked at the cracked mirror on the wall. This time, I didn't see just my reflection. I saw a figure beside me. Not a shadow, but something more. something that seemed to be watching with intention. Fear turned to terror. I knew this wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't my imagination or some illusion. Something was there. Something was with me. I left the room quickly and made my way to the living room. The house, once silent and empty, had become suffocating. The furniture seemed to be watching me, and the corners of the room blended into a dense, shadowy void I couldn't comprehend. That's when I realized something had manifested differently. It was as if silence had become a physical presence, a pressure in the air. My heart pounded as I tried to understand what was happening. I moved toward the window and looked outside, but the street was empty, as always. Yet inside me everything felt on the verge of collapse. The fear that had been an unsettling presence now felt much deeper. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. But the more I fought against it, the clearer it became. There was no escape. That house had a life of its own, and I was part of it in a way I didn't understand. I returned to the notebook, knowing I needed to finish what I had started. This was more than a strange coincidence or a nightmare. It was real. I had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. From the moment I stepped into that house, one question haunted me. What was happening? Everything seemed to be falling apart around me. The nights became longer and more restless, as if silence itself held secrets I could no longer ignore. After my last encounter with the notebook and the shadows that appeared, I felt an uncontrollable urge to act. Gripping a flashlight, some courage, and a glimmer of hope, I made my way to the basement, the one part of the house I had always avoided. The staircase creaked with each step. The light from the flashlight danced across the worn walls and cobweb-covered floor. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the memories of something forgotten lingered in every breath. At the bottom of the stairs, an old, rusty door awaited. With some effort, I pushed it open. Inside, the space was even darker, almost unrecognizable. Piles of old boxes, dust-covered objects, and the unmistakable smell of mildew clung to every breath. I moved cautiously, scanning every corner, searching for a clue. On one wall, a strange stain drew my attention, as if something had been there for a long time. Behind the stain, I found a hidden drawer, barely visible in the shadows. Pulling it out with difficulty, a faint echo followed me. Inside, I found something that made me pause. An old, rusted key, along with more pages from the notebook, now yellowed and fragile. With the key in hand, I made my way to a door at the end of the hallway, one that had always appeared as just a blank wall. I placed the key in the lock, and with a faint click, the door creaked open. What I found on the other side was completely different from the rest of the house. In the center stood an old, worn velvet chair. The room was even darker, as though it existed beyond the reach of light. I moved toward the chair and sat down. Silence consumed me once again. But this time I felt a different presence, a sense that someone or something was observing from within the room. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. The pages of the notebook lay scattered on the floor, forming a trail I felt compelled to follow. I began to read again, my heart racing. They're here. I can't escape. The presence has become part of me. You need to understand. The door was always open, but the eyes were always closed. Now there's no turning back. Each word felt more cryptic, more distant from any logic. But something inside me whispered that there,